former F1 driver released by the FIA as a race steward, as Lewis Hamilton has his first Ferrari crash. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm joined, as always, for this special F1 update by lead editor Ian Parks. Ian, we had to jump on and do an update because, well, it's been quite a busy week in the world of Formula One.
We're just starting to get signs, aren't we, Nick? And hello, everybody. Hello, Nick. That the F1 season now is not that far away. We can see a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. We know we're closing in on the big F1 75 launch on February 18. We've got the the only pre-season test a week later in Bahrain. And then, of course, the middle of March, we've got the opening Grand Prix in Australia. But yes, signs of life. We're coming out of this winter hibernation of F1 and just these first lovely little signs that the season is beginning to click into gear. Obviously, Lewis has taken over a lot of the headlines. And of course, as you've mentioned, wow, big news this week. That crash, of course, which is not his first in a pre-season test with a new team. Is that going to be an omen? We've touched on that on the Racing News 365 site this week. So, because of course, he's crashed with McLaren, he's crashed with Mercedes, and now he's had a crash with Ferrari. And in the second season of those teams, being with those teams, he's gone on to become a world champion with that particular team. So does this mean that Lewis is going to be world champion with Ferrari in 2026? As I say, it's the omens, isn't it?
We've got about 18 months to find out, but let's kickstart with, I guess, the real big news of this week surrounding the FIA. And of course, former F1 driver Johnny Herbert has been released as an F1 race steward. Of course, he was meant to be one of the race stewards for the season opening race in Australia, but well, not anymore. He's gone.
I love Johnny. I think he's a great character. I remember a good few years back now, and we were doing a test together in a car around the Yas Marina circuit in Abu Dhabi, where he was trying to teach me how to drive this bloody car. And I was not very good, let's put it that way, on that particular occasion. But we've been friends ever since. And he was actually meant to be a guest on this podcast. I've tried to ask Johnny on numerous occasions to come on, and he said yes, but it's never quite happened. And as we've seen, he's become quite pronounced in recent months, certainly towards the back end of last season. We've seen content only this month, January as well, where he's been doing these interviews, and quite prominent interviews on these gambling websites. They've definitely become a lot more prevalent, these interviews. Former F1 drivers, Juan Pablo Montoya, Jacques Villeneuve, as I say, Johnny doing these interviews with these gambling websites. And yeah, he's been quite outspoken. And obviously, it was after, I think, what occurred in Singapore last year, a Grand Prix where he was a steward, of course, and he oversaw the hearing into Max Verstappen and the Sweargate controversy at that particular time, with Max, of course, using the F word in an official FIA press conference at the time. And of course, it resulted in that punishment that was eventually handed down of effectively conducting a form of community service, which Max actually did in Rwanda prior to the FIA prize-giving ceremony at the end of the season in mid-December. But it was Johnny's comments at the time that probably drew a considerable amount of attention. And he's done other interviews since then, and he's spoken on quite topical topics, shall we say. And you kind of think, as an FIA steward, should you really be saying that? You know, should you be coming out with those kind of things? Surely there should be a degree of impartiality when you're in that spotlight role as an FIA steward, because we know how prominent a role it has become over time. The position, or the person that is one of the drivers within that panel of stewards on any given Grand Prix weekend is, as I say, in that spotlight. There's a lot of attention on them, particularly when there have been major incidents. And of course, we've got certain punishments or whatever handed down post that incident. For Johnny then to be coming out and explaining certain aspects of not exactly why the punishment was given, but offering his thoughts as to on a particular driver, you then have to think, well, is that the way you're thinking when you actually sit down and deliver your verdict on a topic? You would assume yes. You would assume that, the visor comes down and he retains a professionalism when he is giving, as I say, his verdict on a particular incident in a Grand Prix. For me, I think on occasion, some of his remarks have gone a little bit too far. And of course, what's eventually happened is that it looks like the FIA has decided enough is enough. Johnny, come on in. Let's have a chat. Let's see, what's going to happen going forward. And it was ultimately decided that and I'll just read part of the statement. It was ultimately decided that it was, after discussion, it was mutually agreed that Johnny Herbert's duties as an FIA steward and that of a media pundit were incompatible. That, of course, being the primary word, incompatible. So it's quite clear that the FIA felt that he could not be retained in that role as an FIA steward if he was going to continue to conduct these media interviews away from a racetrack. Obviously, he's going to get paid for his time, quite naturally. So he's probably weighed up the pros and cons of doing one over the other. And they've decided that actually, Johnny, thank you ever so much for your service. And he's been doing this job for 15 years as well, let's not forget. So quite a long period of time. And of course, probably one of the reasons why he's taken this step back as well is the following day, after the FIA released that statement, we saw he got this position as well as a global ambassador with Lola Cars. So that's going to be taking up a degree of his time as well. So I think it's the right decision. But I think now what's come out of this is that this has set quite a precedent. And the FIA will be expecting its driver stewards, i.e. the stewards that were drivers or that are on the panels at the Grand Prix, you do this job, you're focused on this job, you cannot be expected to then go and do interviews after an event has taken place.
Yeah, and that's a topic as well we're going to discuss in a lot more detail in Monday's podcast. It's a very interesting precedent, like you just said, that looks like perhaps is going to come into play. But let's move on to Lewis Hamilton, because obviously this is his second week with Ferrari. They've been in Barcelona testing. Of course, they're in Barcelona again next week for a Pirelli tyre test. But of course, the big story surrounding Lewis is his first crash in red, reportedly in the last sector. No damage to Lewis. He was uninjured. Some damage to the car. But I mean, it's interesting because, as you mentioned at the top of this F1 update, he crashed in his first test with Mercedes. He crashed prior to that in his first test with McLaren. And then the following year has gone on to become, world champion. I mean, a bit soon to say his history repeating itself, but nevertheless, for his second week with Ferrari, he's quite clearly trying to find the limits and get comfortable. And I suppose at times that does mean, unfortunately, putting the car on the wall.
Yeah, of course, quite naturally, he's never going to go out and deliberately look to crash. But of course, he will, as any F1 driver that's moved to a new team, and you've got to expect that he was so entrenched in Mercedes and was used to their ways, was used to the way the car handled, had got it set up to the way he would have liked it, with the pedals, the steering wheel, the comfort fit inside the cockpit of the car. And quite obviously going into a new team, new processes, and altogether fundamentally different car for the most part. Yes, okay, it's got four wheels, a steering wheel and brake pedals and accelerator, of course, and all that. But naturally, it would be something that he would be looking to get comfortable within to ensure that he would be as comfortable as possible going into A, the pre-season test, and of course B, then primarily the opening Grand Prix in Australia in mid-March. So yes, as I say, while he wouldn't look deliberately to go out and crash, as you've pointed out quite rightly, Nick, what he will be looking to do will be to explore the absolute limits of this car. And yes, we appreciate it's not the 2025 car. It was the 2023 car he was again testing at the Circuit de Catalunya this week in Barcelona. But obviously, he will be wanting to extract as much performance as possible to get as close to the limit as possible. And of course, in doing that, finding those barriers, finding those lines, there's always going to be a moment in time when you are obviously going to go over that line. And it looks like that's exactly what's happened on this occasion. Unfortunately for Ferrari, for Lewis, and for Charles Leclerc, who was due to follow Lewis on track on Wednesday afternoon, I think it was, that the car was damaged enough that it unfortunately meant Charles was unable to take part in that afternoon's practice session. So a little bit of time to make up for both A, Lewis, B, Charles, of course, and C, Ferrari. It is what it is. Is it an omen? As you say, Nick, we're only going to know at the end of 2026. But if Lewis wanted an omen, it's a weird way to go about it, of course. But this is what's happened this week. So
yeah, I mean, time will tell. Red Bull, they've obviously released their shakedown date. It's going to be on the 25th of February in Bahrain, which is interestingly the exact same date that Mercedes are also doing their shakedown test a day before pre-season testing, the official pre-season test, gets underway.
No surprise. Ordinarily, teams would prefer to go at Silverstone. We've seen Red Bull run at Silverstone. We've seen Mercedes run at Silverstone. That has actually been quite historic for Mercedes to actually conduct a shakedown test at Silverstone. But more often than not, we've seen the conditions are cold, sometimes be raining. It's not really optimal conditions to run a shakedown test, even though it's no more than 100 kilometers of just getting the car up to speed, making sure the electronics are working, various systems are working. But I think in this occasion, bearing in mind that the time constraints, we've got the F175 launch taking place on February the 18th at the O2, and then exactly 1 week later, the teams are going to be in Bahrain. So the fact that both Mercedes and Red Bull are going to be on track at the Bahrain International Circuit on the Tuesday prior to the start of the 3-day preseason test that begins on the following day, the Wednesday. As I say, no surprise. And they're going to get a little bit more out of it because at least then they've got optimal conditions that they know will be consistent throughout the course of the rest of the week.
It's funny that you mentioned, obviously, how cold it's been. It's sometimes quite wet, quite cold if they ever do the shakedown at Silverstone. It's also not ideal in France at the moment in Paul Ricard because McLaren are out there with Pirelli for Pirelli's first test of 2025. And, well, McLaren's running was done in the wet and some parts of the track were -2. Quite chilly. Sticking with Red Bull, and something Racing News 365 learned earlier in this week, which I think has come as a bit of a surprise, is that Yuki Tsunoda has been announced as, or confirmed to Racing News 365 as Red Bull's reserve driver for 2025. Ayumu Iwasa will be the Racing Bull's reserve, but Yuki, the reserve, is quite an interesting one.
I think that's great for him in some respects. Quite obviously, we know he's missed out on the permanent seat to Liam Lawson after Red Bull decided to release Checo Perez after 4 years with the team. We know that Yuki finally managed to get inside the cockpit of a Red Bull in the postseason test in Abu Dhabi that took place on the Tuesday after the preceding final Sunday of the year at the Yas Marina circuit. And by all accounts, he did really well. That was the bottom line. However, we know, of course, that following all those data checks that Christian Horner told us were instigated by the team, when they looked at the data comparing Liam and Yuki, and they compared where Liam was in his process as an F1 driver compared to where Yuki is after 4 seasons as an F1 driver, it was determined, of course, that Liam has the greater potential going forward, and that's why they opted to put him in the cockpit alongside Max Verstappen for this 2025 F1 season. But at least for Yuki, there is something for him to hold on to. You know, we've seen it happen in the past. Quite possibly he could get an opportunity in that car. If Max Verstappen contracts appendicitis, which Alex Albon has done, of course, at Williams, which Carlos Sainz did last year at Ferrari, or swears too often and is given a race ban, who knows?
Although, to be fair, Yuki's probably got the same problem.
Yeah, exactly. In
Yeah.
fairness to Yuki as well, he's also managed to clean up his act quite a bit.
He
But
has.
obviously,
He has.
now going to have to clean it up even more to ensure he stays out of those out of the bad books of the FIA, and to ensure those new punishments aren't enforced that we now know have come into play following the recent revelation about those changes to the regulations. So yeah, at least it's an opportunity for Yuki. As to whether a full-time Red Bull seat will ever become available for him, you got to wonder, has his time gone? Has the opportunity passed him by? If that's what Red Bull are already thinking, if they're looking at the data of a guy that's been 4 years with one particular team, i.e. the sister team, and comparing it to a young guy that only had 11 Grand Prix behind him, you do feel a little bit concerned for Yuki's future. Just another point, actually, Nick, on Red Bull, that I think that we should mention right here, right now, because you asked me about the shakedown test for this year. Now, the fascinating thing that's come out from a Ford presentation that's taken place in the early hours overnight, Thursday going into Friday, is that Christian Horner, being present at that presentation, of course, because we know Red Bull will be using Ford engineering to a certain extent with regard to its new powertrains department. It's going to be, Red Bull Ford going forward into 2026. Christian Horner has come out and revealed that this time next year, so basically we're looking at the end of January, start of February, Red Bull will be on track in Barcelona with the RB. We can only assume it's going to be called 22 if it continues with that chronological order as it has always done over the years. So that gives you some idea as to how early preseason testing is going to start next year. And of course, the reason behind that, folks, in case you're not aware, is because of these brand new regulations, because we got the new power unit coming on board, all new chassis being developed around that power unit system as well. It means that next year there are going to be three-day tests as part of the build-up into the season opening Grand Prix. And it now appears that we have the date, not the exact dates, but a rough date as to when the first of those three-day tests are going to take place and where, which will be the end of January at Barcelona.
Perhaps gives a hint that maybe things in Red Bull powertrains is perhaps going better than maybe some assumed. You never know, the fact they're already thinking that far ahead and already have plans in place and dates in place for testing. Well, who knows? But again, another story where only time will tell. Ian, awesome stuff as always. I want to give a quick well done to Kimi Antonelli, who got his driver's license. Good job, Kimi. From myself and Ian, please be sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel. This has been a special F1 update. We will see you on Monday for the podcast. See you later.
Take care, folks.